Hi, welcome back. Another security stories for you, this time on gangs. I've been asked quite a lot about gangs and whether I would do a video on it, so yeah, no problem. We had quite a lot of experience in gangs, funnily enough working in Brighton. Now most people associate Brighton with like a friendly beach and, you know, a nice tourist place to visit, lots of students. But it did have quite a large population of gangs, some of which were sort of tourist gangs, which I'll get into. Why was it a large population of gangs? Well, because it was very attractive to people that were from London. We had a lot of tourism from London at the weekends coming down to clubs and pubs, because Brighton's full of pretty ladies. Brighton's also full of people that like to take a lot of drugs. So if you're in the business of supplying drugs, it's obviously a pretty good place to go. And that actually shaped some of the first county line stuff that happened in this country. County lines is a term used by the police and the media which describes gangs from inner cities moving out of those inner cities on a sort of temporary basis and going somewhere else, normally somewhere a bit less policed and a bit less robust in its responses, to ply their trade, and also somewhere where they're not competing for territory with other serious gangs. So a place like Brighton is super attractive to those guys. They can jump on a train from London, or they can drive down the 23 straight into Brighton within about an hour, and suddenly they're in a fun party town with lots and lots of people that want to buy their products. And the police down there obviously don't know who these guys are, so that takes a little bit of the sting out of it for them, that they're not suddenly clocked by police officers that are on their case. The police arguably in these, you know, outer areas outside of the metropolitan area are a little bit more soft on things. They take a little bit longer to respond because they haven't got as much money and time to spend on it. The metropolitan police have, you know, bigger funding and obviously an allotment of specific officers to deal with gang crime, and that fades away as you start getting into the counties. The police actually set up an operation called Trident that was started in London by the Met Police, and that was specifically looking at that. They called it at the time black on black crime. This focused solely on gangs and gun crime, and that actually moved down to have a branch in Brighton as well, because Brighton had become such a hub for these people. So you know, we were up against it somewhat, and it might surprise you some of the stuff I've got to say on the subject, because it wasn't as kind of Wild West as one might think, and I'll go into why. So we were obviously running some clubs. Some of them put on R&B nights and hip-hop nights, etc., and those were the nights that generally attracted the kind of gang dudes. It was hard for us to discern who was who, because none of us are in that community. None of the door guys were. These people were coming from a completely different town, so we had no clue who they were. And you couldn't do it on the sort of stereotypical, oh look, that guy's got a walking with a limp and has got some gold teeth and too much jewellery on, because literally everyone that came to the club looked like that. And a large percentage of the people that came there, it was just simply a fashion thing. It wasn't to do with them being a gang or any criminal activity. They just enjoyed the music. So it made it really tough for us to try and discern who was who. So we just had to let people in that seemed decent on the door, and then kind of change our minds as time went on, as we started noticing things happening. A lot of the gangs would turn up late to these events, and that was very interesting for the door staff. In Brighton at the time, a lot of the clubs tried to avoid trouble by shutting the doors at, say, midnight, but they would stay open till about 4 in the morning. This was at the beginnings of the 24-hour opening period in the UK, which was quite a new novelty thing back then. The clubs and pubs really wanted to do it, but they didn't want all the hassle of having like incredibly drunk or drugged up people turning up at 2, 3 in the morning, etc., because the more hassle they have at those late times, the more chance they had of losing their license. There was no specific law that stopped them from coming in other than the club's own policy. So of course sometimes the doorman would guest these guys in late for a back pocket, you know, a tenner in the back pocket or something. So in the hip hop R&B world, most people were incredibly polite on the way in. They didn't really want to associate with us because of course we looked kind of straight-laced to them. We weren't in their scene and their culture. We had one doorman that was a guy who'd come over from the US. He was actually an ex-NFL player, and he got on really well with everyone because they had some sort of shared culture and experience. But for people like me, you know, I was just polite. I let everyone in. I didn't really make any sort of judgments because, as I said, I don't know anything about that culture. I had to treat people as I found them. There were some other doormen that I witnessed that were clearly racist guys. You know, they didn't like anyone, and generally speaking, if I was in control of those doors, I would eradicate those doormen. Number one, because I don't like people that are just blatantly racist, and number two, because it actually would cause us a lot of problems, because they would make stupid comments and say unpleasant things to people, and then of course we had more trouble on the door than we actually wanted to have, so that wasn't good for anyone. Once we had kind of filtered it down to a professional and decent door team, it was just a case of seeing how things went. You know, we would search people that we felt were looking like we should search them. It's a private club, so we can search whoever we want and basically say, look, these are the conditions of entry. You can either be searched, and our main interest was in weapons. We didn't want people bringing weapons into the club. You're never going to realistically find drugs when you're searching people. You know, all this stuff about, oh, let's search everyone for drugs. People always talk about that, politicians. And drugs are very small objects, and the human body has many different hiding places for small objects, and some of those hiding places you will never be able to look at or look into, if you get my meaning. And generally people that are used to bringing drugs into clubs, you know, they will often give them to females. The females will put those packages in certain places. They cannot be viewed by anyone like me doing security, so it's a pointless kind of waste of time to try really desperately to find drugs on people unless they're absolute idiots. The people that you do tend to find drugs on are, generally speaking, drunk fools that kind of forget that they've got a wrap of coke in their pocket or something and you find it by accident. People that are really serious into bringing drugs into a venue, they're not going to do that. So we were looking for weapons and stuff. We used to search people, and occasionally we would find something, most of the time not, because these guys weren't stupid. And this is where it leads me to say, you know, it wasn't like the Wild West. Everyone's like, oh, talk about gangs, because they imagine there's a lot of violence. We saw violence that was kind of from outside of the club, and the reason is this: because the gangs, unlike just randomly violent people, the gangs at the time, their main interest was making money. You know, they're an organised criminal group. They want to come to these clubs, they want to service the people that want drugs in those clubs, and then leave with their profits and get their profits back home. That's their whole MO. The last thing they want to do is have some pointless fight or get super drunk and do some stupid stuff and then get arrested and lose all the stuff they've worked hard to build up. And at the time, these gangs were in the sort of 20 to 30 something age category, so they were reasonably mature people, and they had a reasonably mature criminal operation going. Of course, it took us a while to suss out who was who and who was conducting these criminal operations. We could obviously tell from the way that they were behaving in the club, etc. And a lot of the time we would have to remove these guys, you know, and just say, look, it's time to leave. We've clocked you, you know, serving up to people, and we have to get rid of you. And pretty much every single time they would literally say no problem and just walk and leave, you know, completely quietly, no hassle at all. Very unlike the normal people we dealt with in clubs, where you would have to pull someone who was acting the fool and you say you've got to leave and they start swinging punches at you. These guys were placid. When it came to two gangs kind of coming together, if there was some territorial issue, then that became problematic. We had one club where it was very popular on the R&B nights. You had a kind of Pakistani stroke Asian community and some of the gangs that were present in that, and then you had a black community and they had some gangs present in that, and both communities also had lots and lots of people that were just there to have an enjoyable evening. But both of those communities were rivals pretty much in terms of the gang stuff, so they had some pretty savage fights with each other. And in the main, we used to only hear about this stuff, you know, that as I got talking to these dudes and they started telling me things, they would start talking to me about the things that had been going on between the gangs and the wars that had been going on. And most of that was gang on gang. It was very specific. They tried not to target members of the public or accidentally involve members of the public, because again, their main concern was fighting for their territories and not bringing heat on themselves. The last thing any of them wanted was the police to be turning up. And I think there was a kind of opinion on their part that if they just hurt each other and the police knew these gangs were just sort of popping each other off, there wasn't such a concern as there would have been if someone had died and they had been a member of the public. And I think, you know, we all saw that sort of thing in the news, that when some random member of the public is injured or killed in the crossfire of these gang related stuff, there's a massive outcry. You know, everyone wants that person found, understandably, but when it's kind of gang on gang and a gang member is killed, it hardly even makes the news. So to a degree, they were right in that aspect. The only time I can remember, you know, like preventing someone from coming in and things were kind of more serious, there was a guy that used to turn up, all gold teeth, kind of older. He was in his like late 30s, early 40s, I guess. Had a really hoarse voice, like he had been smoking Marlboro Reds for the last 50 years. Maybe he'd been smoking something else, who knows. He turned up one night really aggressive. He had actually been okay with us up until then, really leery, wouldn't let him in, and then he opened up his jacket and kind of made some veiled threat, and he had like a really big machete taped on the inside of his jacket. So we were trying to calm this dude down. He was basically insinuating that he would cut through us in order to get into the club because there was someone in the club that had screwed him over on some deal. So we were kind of arguing back and forth about him not coming in, and at the same time the police were over the road videoing the situation, because I think probably these the groups from the Metropolitan Police in London were looking at these clubs, because of course lots of these gang dudes were coming in and out, and they were simply recording, you know, gathering information, gathering evidence for their own cases, probably elongated like proceeds of crime cases and stuff like that, and criminal enterprises that they were cracking down on. So they immediately came over when they saw this guy becoming really aggressive and searched him, found a machete. They then found some drugs in his pocket, and they found like a few £1,000 in his other pocket. As they're marching him away, he then blips his car key as they're sort of walking him down the road, and he wants to get something out of his car. And I'm thinking, why would you do that? So now the police are searching his car, and in the boot of his car he's got like a bin liner full of weed, and then he's got a carrier bag full of Class A drugs. So of course the police are super happy with him because he just served himself up on a platter to them. Not the most intelligent guy on the planet. But that was kind of the only time where we had someone blatantly trying to get in with a weapon and saying that they were going to do people real harm. We did have, the only other incident I can remember with gangs was there was a couple of kind of rival gangs, and there was some argument that kicked off where they were looking at each other's partners, and it was actually two girls in the end that kicked off, and one of the girls smashed the other one in the face with a champagne bottle and then stabbed the broken part of it into her face. And you've really got to be, I've seen a lot of people hit with champagne bottles. It's not like the movies. Normally they do not break, they just go donk, and they absolutely wreck people. I mean, they break people's skulls because they're super heavy, and especially the base is very, very thick. Don't forget, they're made to take a lot of pressure, a champagne bottle. You know, in transport they're getting shaken around and they've got to hold all that pressure in, so they are thick and heavy objects. This particular one broke at the base, leaving a kind of jagged piece of glass. The girl then stuck it into this other girl's face, and it actually cut out the whole side of her cheek. And the guys were super unhappy about that because of course it's bringing heat onto their operation. But she was carted off by an ambulance. The other girl was arrested, and I saw that girl about 2 or 3 months later, and she had a horrific scar. You know, they had managed to reattach the cheek, which had almost been completely removed by this champagne bottle, but she was a beautiful girl, and she's never going to look the same again. You know, it completely messed her up. She came in to thank us all because we had obviously helped her, tried to keep her calm, done some basic levels of first aid whilst we were waiting for the ambulance to come. And bless her, she actually came in to say thanks to us all. And, you know, she was a naughty girl herself. These girls weren't kind of like innocent little lost princesses. You know, they knew what they were into. It was kind of a bit heart-wrenching actually to have someone that was sort of from quite a tough lifestyle that had then gone through that horrific incident and had purposely come in to say thanks to us guys. You know, it was pretty moving. But yeah, I really felt bad for her, because it's, guys can pick up a scar and kind of get away with it. You know, I've got a couple and people go, oh, that's cool or whatever. But if a girl has a massive scar across her face, that's really a big problem for her, because it really knocks their self-esteem. And I can't even begin to think how that would be to go through the rest of your life like that. The only other issue that arose was that we did have quite a few people come to us because we were kind of well known in the South Coast for running doors and being guys that would stand up to people, you know, that we wouldn't take any nonsense, we never backed down, we were there to do a job and we did it well. And we achieved a certain level of status in the community, I guess. And we had some people come and say, you know, I need your help. I'm getting bothered by gangs. And what was happening, this was the first time in the UK that cuckooing had come around. So if you don't know what that term is, it's where the county lines guys will set up shop in generally a girl's house, often a single mother. How did that come about? Well, we actually saw that happening in Brighton. You'll go to these R&B clubs, and a lot of girls that maybe hadn't had much luck on the dating circuit, generally white girls, they had been not very lucky on the dating circuit. They'd had a kid with someone, they'd been left, they weren't treated particularly well. A lot of them were fairly overweight, and you might think, oh, that's a bit harsh, but this is actually, it's got some cultural importance, because they were not maybe considered to be beautiful girls by other white guys, white British guys, who at the time liked these sort of lean model looking girls. But in the black community, you know, the curvy figure, the Beyonce bum and all that kind of thing was a really big thing, and probably still is to some degree. So these girls were actually super popular. You know, if they had a big ass and they were shaking it around on the dance floor, they would have a lot of interest from guys. And of course, being desperate for interest and attention, it was very attractive for them to go to these clubs. The girls were pretty naive. They had no experience of gang related stuff or anything. They were just going to a nightclub to basically have a dance and try and pull a fella. They would be inundated with this attention from these guys. A lot of the guys were in the gang related scene. So then they would get in with this girl, and they realised that they could sort of utilise this lover boy method. That's what they're coining it nowadays. I think Andrew Tate, that's what they're talking about, him being charged with using this similar method. So they would make out they really like these girls. They would say a sob story, I've got nowhere to stay, etc. Can I stay at your place? They would then set up shop in this girl's house. So the girl would be there living with her kid or kids. This guy's living there as well, rent free. The girl's kind of subsidising him living there. And then he starts saying, oh, by the way, some people are going to come around and buy some stuff. And of course he set up shop selling drugs in the house. And this is how that county lines thing spread out. That it went from just supplying clubs and stuff and actually actively walking around in the clubs to then realising that they could set up more permanent shops in naive people's houses, normally young girls. And then if the young girl got fed up at all or didn't want them there anymore, they would utilise like threats of violence and sometimes violence to keep in that place. And sometimes I've even witnessed girls being kind of thrown out of their houses, so the girl would become so frightened and so abused, she would then go and have to live with her mother or something like that, and the guys would retain the house whilst the benefit system was still paying for it, thinking that the girl was living there. So that's what the cuckooing thing is. And it's obviously relating to the bird that nicks other birds' nests, the cuckoo. That's where the term came from. But we sometimes had these girls, and sometimes even young guys that were really naive, that were getting used in the same way, come to us and say, you know, can you have a word with these people? We're too frightened to go to the police. We don't know what to do. you know, I'm feeling suicidal. So it was pretty shocking to see that kind of thing. We were able to help some of those people. We just used to tell the guys straight, the gang guys, and say, look, we're going to go to the police and basically tell them what you're up to in this person's house. And we used to lie and say that this person was a relation of one of our guys and that she couldn't be messed with, and they would have to get out of the house. And they would be upset about that. They would threaten us or whatever, and we didn't care about the threats. Eventually, you know, they would leave because, as I said, they don't want heat from the old Bill. They didn't want any sort of grief with us because that again would bring heat from the police. So they would then move on and probably do that to someone else. There was always a huge reluctance on the part of the victims to actually go to the police, because a lot of these victims had also been coerced into becoming part of the criminality. So a lot of the girls would then be left large bulks of Class A drugs and be expected to sell them during the week while these guys went back to London. And they were doing that, you know, under coercion and under threat of violence. So then the guys would say, you know, you can't grasp me up and get me out of the house because you've been doing it as well, and you would go to prison too. So not only is the girl frightened of getting hurt by these guys, but now she's also frightened to go to the police because she's obviously been part of the drug operation. So it was nice to be able to help some of those people. And like I said, boys were involved as well, young lads. Generally speaking, the young lads were trying to make a bit of extra money as runners and stuff. They weren't the brightest. They were often quite vulnerable, maybe sort of slightly vulnerable in terms of having conditions, a bit Asperger's-y and stuff, which wasn't really known about at the time. And these gangs would get their claws into these dudes and kind of do exactly the same thing, you know, make out they were like buddies. These guys hadn't had many good friends or large groups of friends they could hang around with. Suddenly they had all these dudes coming back to their house after the club, giving them free drugs, giving them drinks, buying them cigarettes. Everything seemed great for them. And then not long after that, they realised they had a whole bunch of dudes kind of staying in their house whenever they wanted, and the house was being used as a drug den, like a trap house. So they were then frightened, you know, because they would say, hey, I need you all to leave. And of course, everyone would laugh at them and say, yeah, we're not going anywhere. So a pretty unpleasant situation. The only other thing that we had to do with gangs really down in Brighton was when the Albanian guys moved in. They specifically moved in to take over the door security. And again, this was in the early 2000s. It was at the time when there was a lot of freedom of movement stuff going on with the EU, but they weren't actually part of the EU, but they were coming over anyway, and they actively tried to take on all the clubs because they told me exactly why. You know, I worked with quite a lot of them. Sometimes they would send one or two guys, they would pick up jobs, and then slowly over time they would try and sort of ingrain themselves and then get rid of the old door team and push a new one in. And they told me, you know, we've come over from Albania, a lot of them had criminal records, and they were actually surprised that they had been allowed over considering the criminal record. But unbelievably, this wasn't particularly checked. They were as shocked as anyone else that they were able to come here. They did so, and then their aim was basically to commit crime over here, on drug dealing mainly, and they were quite used to doing that in Albania. But the problem they had in Albania is when they got caught by the police there, it was horrendously brutal. They would get severe beatings, some of them would get even killed by police, and they would never come back. And the jail system there was horrendous. They would describe it as being, you know, absolutely brutal. You did not want to go in there at all. So they saw that they could come over here, commit the same criminality, but the punishments over here were much less. You know, the police were very, very nice compared to the police they had. The police over here aren't going to brutally try and beat them and kill them. They would then go to a prison over here that had like Sky TV, a snooker hall, you know, like lots of things to do, sporting activities. You could learn to be a chef. So compared to the prison that they had over there, which was horrific, the prison over here was lovely for them. And a lot of them even said the prisons over here were nicer than the houses that they stayed in Albania, because obviously they were in very poverty-stricken areas, and Albania wasn't doing that well at the time. So there was no real deterrent in terms of prison or arrest over here. In fact, it was kind of a bonus to them if they got a couple of years in what they saw as quite a nice B&B. and they were actively trying to take all the doors, and they were doing so pretty violently. So we did have quite a few run-ins with those guys, and we actively tried to keep them out of our doors. They would then kind of start trouble, and a lot of them would try and cause trouble in the venues to make your door team look bad, so that they could then send in some other guys who would kind of offer their services and try and push the old door team out. So we had quite a few run-ins with them. They were pretty violent guys, but at the same time they were kind of classic bullies, that they would really try hard to intimidate and sometimes become super aggressive. But they were used to dealing with people that would back down. You know, they were used to dealing with people that would run away with their tail between their legs. And when they came up against a robust team of guys that were quite happy to meet force with force, they sort of re-evaluated their options and probably just found safer and easier routes forward. And I've often found that in the criminal world, you know, this idea that we see in films where a criminal kind of, they set their sights on something and you have to cooperate or you're dead or whatever, that really sells people the wrong idea. In my experience, most serious criminality is like, they will try it on and then they will go for an easier option if they find that you're literally like a sort of wall. You know, if you stand there and you're immovable, and I've lost count of the amount of times I've said to guys, like, I'm sure you could kill me, but you're going to have to do something like that because I'm here doing a job, I'm immovable, I'm not going to go anywhere, and you're going to have to make the next decision. And generally speaking, at that point, you know, it's going to be very rare that someone's just going to whack you unless you're involved in that gang life yourself. You're ultimately a civilian. They don't want the heat. They're going to move somewhere else and try and use their intimidation tactics somewhere else. Because if gangs are just shooting people on the door or stabbing people on the door, then they're very quickly going to be arrested and they're not going to be a very successful gang. So it's a high stakes gamble on our part, but it's a gamble that's incredibly heavily weighted in our favour. We've got like a 99.9% chance these guys are going to walk away, and a 0.1% chance that one of them's going to do something utterly crazy. Every single time I've known that gangs have actually acted on someone who's not another gang member, you know, there's been some sort of tie there that maybe the guy ran up a huge drug debt or something. There's always some sort of link. I've rarely seen that they're just doing something at random. But that has changed, because don't forget, when I was dealing with these guys, it was all quite new in the UK, and these guys were in the 20 to 30-year-old category. Things have changed now. We've now got what would have been their runners, you know, these little lads of sort of 12 to 18 years old. They've now formed their own gangs. So you've now got much younger guys who are full of kind of piss and importance. The money situation is less important to them, and the respect and the gang status is far more important. So they're trying to impress, they're trying to do crazy stuff to show off. They see going to prison or going to a young offenders institution as kind of a passing out parade or a badge of honour. So those guys are way more likely to suddenly inflict ridiculous levels of violence, even on people that have nothing to do with the gang life, because they're simply trying to earn their reputation. Very dangerous. I would much rather have dealt with those older guys that we were dealing with that kind of, they were criminals, but they had a kind of code of ethics. It wasn't a code of ethics that you might hear that the old cockneys and stuff talk about, but it was a kind of code of ethics of sorts, and it was predictable enough that we could kind of utilise that and play that game with them. Nowadays I wouldn't dream of doing that. You know, I wouldn't want to be on the door in a R&B club or a hip-hop club now, because you're going to get some little 16, 17-year-old come up, and if you don't let him in, he's going to stab you because, you know, you've upset him in front of his mates. It's simple as that. And he doesn't care that that's thwarted their drug operation for the night. He's pretty chuffed that he's been arrested and his mates think he's a badass. So yeah, good luck if you're in security now. I don't envy you at all, and you know, I feel sorry for people that have to deal with these little rats, but that's the way society's gone. And that ties in exactly with the last video I made of the zombie knife ban we've got. And when we see that on the news, the people that are using those kind of blades on the streets are these feral little gang boys that are just running around hacking at each other, because they literally, all they care about is this kind of gang respect, and they've got zero interest in sort of accomplishing anything positive and worthwhile in life. Their whole focus is on the respect they can maintain within the gang side. Terrible situation, and I have no idea how this country is going to deal with that, because it is a complex and expensive issue, and it won't be dealt with simply by eradicating blades from the streets, or certain types of blades. Those kids will always find a way to hurt each other. You've got to stop them wanting to hurt each other in the first place. I hope that's been enlightening. It was pretty eye-opening to me. It's not a world that I had ever intended to be immersed in, or had any interest in particularly, until I was actually sat in the middle of it. And as usual, I'm an avid people watcher, and my interest in psychology and sociology kind of kept me glued and watching what these guys got up to and how they behaved. But yeah, for sure, very, very interesting. If you've got any comments on this subject, leave them down below. If you've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them as always. Guys, have a great weekend. I'll catch you all soon.